So today we have a session which Sheila and I did last year, and she reminded me that we had 3 hours to do it. I don't know how we filled it, but we did. But today we have an hour and 45 minutes, which is plenty. And each of us will speak for about 20 minutes about our professional evolution as historians. And as the oldest one, I'm supposed to begin. I'm only
just.
Yes, I'm only a few months older. Why are we taking such pride in that? Because we survived, right? How we got into this profession, how we conceived the work we're doing, our evolution professionally as historians of the Soviet Union and Russia. So I was born so long ago, 1940, and remember, the oldest memory I have is of the day that President Franklin Roosevelt died in 1945. I was 4.5 years old. My mother was very sad. She lay on the couch and I asked her about why. She said, well, the president died. I asked her what died is. She said, you go to sleep and you don't wake up. I said, well, if I go to sleep, will I not wake up? And my mother, who was the sweetest, most wonderful, caring person, said, get out of here. I'm tired of talking to you. So that was, I was raised by a wonderful mother, but there were limits. As we grew up in the years of the Cold War, my father would regale me and my sister Linda with stories of his childhood in Tbilisi, in Tiflis, at the time of the revolution. And he told about how difficult it was selling water on the streets. He was a petty thief, all kinds of things like that. The day the Bolsheviks came to Tbilisi, how the Mensheviks made heroic speeches and then fled in their cars to Batumi, and how the Bolsheviks came over the hill, as he remembers singing the Internationale, Vstavai, Praklati za Klemyon, wonderful song. And how they hid their sister Siran because she was very beautiful and they had heard that the Bolsheviks raped women. They didn't hide Seda, the other sister, she was kind of plain. So this was the stories he would tell us. And when I wrote the book, The Making of the Georgian Nation, I put some of those things, not all, in the book. So we grew up with these stories about Tiflis, the revolution, etc. And what I didn't know so well was the history of my grandfather, which later, just this year, in fact, in a lecture at UCLA, I began to seriously research. So Grigor Suny was an ethnomusicologist and composer who was trained at Etchmiadzin, the holy city of the Armenians, then went to St. Petersburg, where his teacher was Rimsky-Korsakov and a man named Alexander Glazunov, who you may not know. At the same time that he was working on these folk songs, a kind of Bartok and so forth, along with the famous Gomitas, Grigor Suny also was a revolutionary. He was a member of the Dashnag party, and I loosely said in my talk at UCLA in February that he was a terrorist. And you have to be careful with that. Terrorists, I think it was Yuri yesterday said that or maybe it was Dominique, terrorism means anyone you don't agree with, apparently. Terrorism is a tactic, right? It's a weapon of the weak. It's things like, in those days in the Russian Empire, killing figures that were repulsive or had harmed people, or even your own members of the party if they had betrayed you, right? So it was a serious thing. And Grigor Suny, as a member of this Armenian Nationalist Party, was part of that. When he they fled. When the Bolsheviks came to Tbilisi, he took the family of 11 to Batumi, to Istanbul. When the Kemalists came, they went to America. In America, Armenia was now Soviet. He joined a small group called Haraj Dimakan, which means progressive. They were associated with the Communist Party, right? So he moved from Dashnag to communist. The Dashnags then threatened him. In 1937, he made a speech to that little group against Stalin and against the purges in Armenia. For that, he was thrown out of the party. He was condemned, and his music was never again played in Soviet Armenia. And we have books with sickle and hammer, son, over the Mount Ararat, and all of that stopped. He was no longer persona grata in Soviet Armenia until the 60s, when he was slightly revived. I went to the archive yesterday, Music and Literary Archive yesterday, and looked at his fond, and they have a tzutzak or opis, and I photographed it, and we're going to try to bring materials that I have back here. So that's the background. I didn't know him. He died the year before I was born, but my father always told us stories about him because he loved his father. Imagine it's 1959, 1951, it's the height of the Cold War and McCarthyism. And I had to prepare a report for my sixth grade class in Philadelphia, where I was born. And my father said to me, Ron, why don't you talk about the Soviet Union and how it's not as bad as people say? So this little skinny, I was at that time, little boy, begins writing this report. How they won the Second World War, how many tons of pig iron they produce every year, how many cities, San Francisco, as I said, that they built after World War II, etc. And I gave this little report. And my sixth grade teacher turned white. This is McCarthy time. This is a dangerous time. We've now entered a time that's in some ways worse than McCarthyism. And from that day on, she asked me, who told you this? I said, my daddy told me. So that was my initiation in Soviet history. And after that, from the time of this was sixth grade until I left school, I was known as Comrade Suny. So with that, I took with a measure of pride. Well, as I grew up, and I did eventually, I became more and more interested in the Soviet Union. It was extremely relevant at the time. And so I went to college, first Tufts, then Swarthmore College and Columbia University, and worked with Leopold Haimson, Mark Ryoff, a number of distinguished, Alexander Dowlin, and I wrote a dissertation. Now, I urge you, if you're in that stage where you're about to write your dissertation, you should think carefully about what you're going to write about. That day that we were going to give topics to our mentor, I had not prepared. But luckily they started at the other end of the room and they came around and I'm thinking, what the hell am I going to talk about? And I remember reading a book by Bertrand Wolff. He was a communist and then a Bukharinist, and then he left the Communist Party, as many of these renegades did, and became an anti-communist, ended up at the Hoover Institution, where many distinguished conservatives end up. I had read the book, and there was an Armenian in that book. Well, I was Armenian enough, even though my family was not nationalistic, but very, very culturally Armenian. There was a guy named Stepan Shaumyan. So I said, this totally accidentally. Now, when you make this choice, it's going to mean 10 years of your life, or even more. And I said, I'm going to write about Stepan Shaumyan and the Baku Commune, which I did, and that was my first book. When that book was published, I was accused in Baku of bourgeoisная фальсификация истории Azerbaijana. I was accused of being a falsifier. And in America, I was considered a too far left, a Marxist. Also, when people say Marxist, they mean you're dogmatic, you're ideological, because liberals, of course, are not ideological. They're balanced and in the middle, right? And so you pay a price. But there were jobs for everybody. So it was a certain amount of time, and I never shirked, saying what I wanted. I thought that was the wonderful privilege of being in the academy, that you could in fact be so open and frank. And things worked out pretty well. I taught for 13 years at Oberlin College, another 13 years at Michigan. Then I went to Chicago for 11 years and worked with Sheila Fitzpatrick. We had a wonderful workshop there and trained lots of graduate students. I was in political science as well. I'm going to just talk about two things now. One is, what kind of history do I think I do, and why I think it's worth thinking about that. I would worry nowadays if you do nationalist history. I would worry that nationalism is a powerful reductionist point of view and philosophy limits the way you would think about history. I think on the opposite, that Marxism, at least the Marxism that I have imbibed, and that is now more current, it's not Marxism-Leninism, it's not particularly dogmatic, is based on critique. It's based on critique, and it's based on trying to posit or imagine futures beyond capitalism, right? That may be fantastic, that may be utopian, but that's the way. In other words, you try to stand outside of the society you live in and adopt a critical attitude toward the status quo and toward what's working. And it's a very flexible point of view, this current, what I'd call current Western Marxism. It's always developing and changing. But it does emphasize certain things. It emphasizes, for instance, moving away from the top of society, from political history, towards what we called social history, right? And it happened that in the 1970s, largely, there was a huge move to move away from great man history, political history, and focus more on society itself. And Sheila was a proponent of this. I was a proponent, Moshe Levine, many others in our cohort of our age, etc. Well, I would say my history was, yes, social history, but also socialist history. And the biggest influence were a group of British Marxists, people like Marxist historians like E.P. Thompson, Eric Hobsbawm, George Roudet, who I think is Australian, is that right?
He was certainly in Australia.
Yeah, and a number of others. And that group of historians, brilliant people, were extremely intellectual in the way that we did history. But I had chosen to write about Baku. And then the second book was about the making of the Georgian nation. Also, I was condemned in Georgia, an Armenian, a Marxist, writing a history of our country. Why have they done that, etc. So these were problems. But, and people who studied nationalities, this might seem strange to you now, were marginalized in the profession. We had to do our history of Georgia or Armenia, but also know Russian history really well, because that's what you were going to teach at Oberlin or Michigan or in political science at Chicago. So that meant, yeah, you're doing well, you're working hard, you're getting to make a name for yourself, etc. And then came 1988. Roughly, Gorbachev was in power, and Armenians in Karabakh and Yerevan began to erupt, explode, and begin to question the nationality policy and why Karabakh is in Azerbaijan, etc. And few people had studied the non-Russian peoples. Almost all major Russian historians concentrated on Russia. Political scientists on the very top, on the Kremlin, who's standing next to Brezhnev or whatever. So this social history and also history from the periphery suddenly made me instantly famous. Instantly famous. Suddenly CBS is calling, Dan Rather, PBS is calling. And so I get a phone call in my mother's house, and they said, Professor Suny, we want you to come to Washington to talk to us. I said, well, who are you? They said, we're the Central Intelligence Agency. I said, really? Do you know anything about me? They said, we know all about you. So I went back to Ann Arbor, and I talked to my colleagues, and I said, what should I? He said, well, you're a citizen of this country. Those people have been listening to the Richard Pipes and all of those guys all these years. Let them listen to someone on the left for a change. So I went, right? We walked through a door, a nondescript building. We sit down, and they said, okay, Professor, yeah, what's going on? And I literally started my talk like this. I said, well, the Cold War truly must be over when the CIA asks the Marxists to tell them about the Soviet Union. No one laughed. The CIA does not have a sense of humor. And for almost 10 or 12 years, I would be called to Washington to talk at the Pentagon, State Department, until eventually they developed their own experts and they didn't need some crazy lefty to come and tell them anything. But it was an extraordinary period. And as a result of that, I was invited to Stanford to give a series of lectures just as the Soviet Union just before the Soviet Union disintegrated, and they resulted in a 1993 book called The Revenge of the Past, Nationalism, Revolution, and the Collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, those were lectures, and those were an accumulation, a kind of synthetic reading of Soviet nationality policy, the contradictions thereof, and how this contributed to the disintegration of the Soviet Union. And my friend Norman Naimark wrote an introduction to that, which I think misunderstood what the book was about, but when I reread it, I realized I didn't make it as clear as because my real argument was, yes, there were these nations or potential nation states developing within the Soviet Union, but the real reason the Soviet Union collapsed was because the center committed suicide. It destroyed itself. And then all this other stuff was there, and it erupted. Let's not forget that in March 1991, 76.8% of Soviet peoples voted to keep the Soviet Union. A few months later, there was a coup d'etat. We'll talk about this later. Coup d'etat, and the whole thing was over, and every country went its own way. I love that book, and I would urge you, if you haven't read it, I may have sent a PDF with you, but it's a very synthetic book, and it's very much used not by historians, but by political scientists. And it may have been it is the book that got me the job at Chicago in a discipline in which I had not really been trained. And so, to sum up, it's been a good run. I'm surprised that someone of my political thinking could have had a career like this. It wasn't without its limits. I'm sure there were jobs for which I was not considered, et cetera, but, Oberlin, Michigan, Chicago, not a bad run, I will conclude with this statement. I still think of history and doing good critical history, honest, as objective as possible, as neutral as possible, though we know we're all human beings and we've all been formed. As Marx said, who educated the educator? You have to pay attention. Where did you come from? What's your location in time and space and so forth? That you try to do that. Because, as Regis Debray said, truth is revolutionary. So you have to do good critical history. That's the most important thing. And that is a political act. Because I think I've said this before, two things. One, history is the most subversive of sciences. It undercuts, it undermines the myths generated by governments and dominant discourses that keep people imprisoned in bourgeois liberalism and capitalism. And we have to, our effort is to move beyond that. And it is, after all, history, the only database we have to figure out how we got where we are, how we might move beyond that. So if you don't do history, do good political science or sociology or whatever, and you'll have a wonderful life. Thank you.
So I was thinking about how one does the story of one's own professional evolution, and I actually think the most interesting and illuminating is if you go project by project and explain what you were going after with each of these projects. What questions did you want to answer? What was the context that made this seem the most interesting topic? And there's a sort of additional way of doing that, which is in a way yet more interesting if you already know the scholarship, and that is to tell the personal subtext of those choices of topics, because there almost always is. There's the academically formulated thing you're going after, and then there's a personal question that you want to answer, which is often more diffuse and less easy to put your finger on it, but you know it's there. I'm not going to do that because I don't have time, because there would be a lot of books to talk about. So I'm going to take the other approach, which is to do a bit of personal, but above all the institutional story. In other words, I was here, I was there, and so on, to give you that kind of a frame to fit my work in. Now, one of the, Ron is an example of somebody with an absolutely fascinating sort of backstory of being an outsider who comes in. I think there are an awful lot of interesting backstories of people in Russian studies, interesting and exotic. Now, I've got the really boring one. I'm Australian. Now, what is possibly interesting about that, except it's very far away, it's the provinces. So if I'm going to set the scene of what kind of Australian, yet more boring, fifth generation Scottish and Irish and English, absolutely nothing there to pick on that's of interest. However, the actual family I grew up in was a sort of outsider family in Australian terms, in the sort of self-consciously intellectual and on the left and bohemian, that kind of setup. So naturally, being on the left bohemian, without a job, no income socialist, my father sent me to a private school. Setting up the kind of contradiction which, if I were going to do this autobiographically more, I would follow through. Anyway, being Australian, I naturally had to leave. That was what all young Australians with aspirations in the late 50s, 60s did. And I left on the same plane as Germaine Greer, the feminist, whom I knew, when we were both Commonwealth scholars. That was that kind of scheme. And of course, I went to Oxford, because that's where Australians went. They went to Oxford or Cambridge. And I went with the idea of studying Soviet history, but I was already aware that nobody did study Soviet history. I had been trained as a historian, and I could see that they didn't, because they didn't have the sources and they didn't have that kind of methodology. So the sort of heading of what I was going to study was Soviet cultural policy in a historical framework. That was a big topic at the time. It was implicitly quite a strongly anti-Soviet policy topic, because the theme was the taming of the arts, the artist in uniform. And there was a lot of sort of Congress of Cultural Freedom support for that kind of thing. So that's where I started off. I was not totally in tune with that approach, but I could do it. I could write. I learned to write in the Oxford way, and the topic I took was, for my dissertation, was Lunacharsky, Anatoly Lunacharsky. He was the first commissar of education and the arts. That was a Narkom Prosvещения, in other words, a commissar of enlightenment, and that's what I called my first book, Commissariat of Enlightenment. What interested me about that was, me personally about that, was that Lunacharsky conceived of himself. He was a Bolshevik, but he was also very much, in his own mind, an intelligent, and he conceived of himself as a bridge between the party and intelligentsia, and I was interested in that bridging role. Anyway, so I very quickly decided that I need to get to the Soviet Union to try and get proper material, archival material, because I saw that there was a lot that was coming into the domain of Soviet scholars. Now, it was not so easy to get to the Soviet Union. You had to go, we're talking 1964, 5, 6 here. You have to go under a government exchange. Australia didn't have an exchange with the Soviet Union, Britain did, but they only took British. And I was Australian, although Australian had been British really only a few years before, but anyway, formally speaking, I wasn't British. But finally, so I get on the exchange, and I show up there, and I basically start asking for archives. Now, on the Soviet period, people didn't get archives, the foreign students. But on the other hand, they did for the imperial period, and even up to 17. And so I suppose I thought there was a chance, or maybe I just thought I had to get them, and so I didn't even evaluate that. Anyway, I went around talking to all the archival the officials and telling them that they had to give me archives because the treaty with the British government required it, and so they would laugh and so on. Anyway, but finally I did. They gave me not what I wanted. What I wanted was Lunacharsky's Lichny Fond, which was in the party archives. They gave me his institutional materials, the commissariat, the ministerial archive, and that was absolutely fascinating. And why it was so fascinating was that the dominant understanding of Soviet politics at that time was in terms of totalitarian model. It's all top-down. It excludes the possibility of bureaucratic politics, of personalistic ties and so on. It's all top-down there, and so there's really it's only the top that's interesting to look at. Now, with the commissariat, I'm looking at not the top, but let's say the third level down. And what I saw was an institution which is constantly arguing itself about policy, then lobbying people in the Central Committee, and if they can, the Politburo to get that policy adopted by the party. So, and they are fighting other institutions with different institutional interests. Now, it was a shock. That's not incompatible. That is incompatible with totalitarian model. It was also incompatible with the Bolshevik sense of what life would be like. It was a big shock to Lunacharsky when he found that as an education minister, he kept arguing with the people in charge of industry because of their different institutional interests. He had not conceived that in a socialist government anything like that could happen. Anyway, so all of that is fascinating. I spent the next 3 years going back and forth on the British exchange until I sort of exhausted my possibility. You know, they couldn't give me any more time on that. Then in the early 70s, I went to the United States. And so I'm in the United States from the 70s, and basically the 1970s is the decade of Columbia in New York. The 1980s is the decade of Texas, University of Texas at Austin. And then from 1990, I was at University of Chicago until I retired from there in 2012 and went to Australia, and I put that in because it's, to my surprise, I wrote a lot of books after I went to Australia, and I continued quite active as a scholar, so that's also a part of the evolution. So I'll just give you a sense of the kind of things that I did in these different contexts. So the book that came out of Oxford was, of course, my dissertation book. That was The Commissariat of Enlightenment. Well received, and well received, except not well received by the Russians. By the Soviets. That goes without saying. They had the two categories. There were the bourgeois falsifiers, and then there were the so-called objective historians. E.H. Carr was a so-called objective. That means he's trying to be fair. Of course, he can't manage it because he's not a Marxist-Leninist, but he's doing his best. I didn't get into that category quite, but I was not so much not really a bourgeois falsifier either, because actually, who cares about education? It was the great advantage of that as a topic. Nobody looks at education and thinks, my God, that's so hot, better stay away from that. They wave you through to a degree if you're on education. So there was a Soviet review of my book, which covers the Narkompros's work from October 1917 to 1921. And this review was a clever review. It was critical, of course. It said, she, as a bourgeois historian, without a proper overview, she wants to tell a story of revolutionary failure. And that is why she chose those dates, because October 1917, the first year is full of hope before they understand that you need some money to expand education. 1921 is when education is shifted onto local budget, which after some puzzlement about that, I realized that means it loses its financing because there is no local budget. In other words, the locals are not local Soviets, haven't got the money to finance it. So it's collapse. It's collapse of those dreams of the first years. So as this reviewer said, I chose those dates specifically to show that the revolution was a failure. Well, I didn't do that. I chose those dates because I was writing, and then I got to the word limit. So I had material up to 1929. archival material. And so I saw I wasn't going to be able to do the rest, so I thought there'll be a part 2, and I stopped. But still, it alerted me to the fact that I always would tell students that your choice of dates is not neutral. Your choice of dates involves some choice about the story that you're going to tell. Now, that early work, in my first years in America, I was living off the capital of those 3 years, well, 1.5 total in a period of 3 years of archival work. And the Cultural Revolution, book Cultural Revolution in Russia was a product of that. That is basically a book. At the end of the 1920s, the Soviets had something which was like a precursor to the Chinese Cultural Revolution, which happened to be going on when I was in the Soviet Union. So there was a very interesting sort of playoff between what I was reading and what I was writing. What I was observing, what I was reading about in the papers. So I wrote an article for this, but I also organized a conference and with other people contributing on the shake-up in culture at the end of the 1920s and the beginning 1930s. Now, one of the things this became highly controversial. It made waves, but a lot of people were upset about it because basically, with Cultural Revolution, the process that I saw was, sure, there is a signal from above saying attack the bourgeoisie in culture, but the people, all kinds of people, take up that signal for their own, to fulfill their own agendas. If you were in any profession and you regarded yourself as an outsider, okay, this is your moment. You will call the people who are the establishment, the bourgeoisie, and you may well win. And some bully boys from the Komsomol can come around and make noise. And I mean, everyone had a lot of fun if they were young in the Cultural Revolution in Russia. Anyway, that became the notion of an argument between those who saw the possibility of initiative from below as well as from above became a very controversial thing in US Sovietology. I was not actually arguing for initiative from below. The situation I didn't exclude that it could happen, but it wasn't happening in the case that I was looking at. What was happening in the case that I was looking at was a signal with responses which were not in detail planned and where people were very definitely following their own agenda. And if you look at the corpus of my work, the notion of people following their own agenda within a framework that's been set from outside, that is a recurring one. Right. So I'm in the US, and one of the things I thought, I was a kind of literary musical person in Australia, apart from being from a left-wing family. Not really left-wing myself, but from left-wing family. So, but when I got to America, the feeling was that literary and musical is not what we need here. We need social science. So I tried to become a social scientist to a degree, and for a while. I stopped after a while. But anyway, education and social mobility is a product of that. That is really part 2 of my story of Nahtkomprost, of the ministry. But it is focused on what became the most important political issue about affirmative action for workers, and also backward, in quotes, nationalities, but above all, workers. And that's an elite formation policy. But putting it in those terms, that I was putting it in a social science framework which I didn't really have when I came to the United States. That was also very upsetting to many people in the United States, in Sovietology, because, and this came as a big surprise to me, I had thought that social mobility was a neutral social science concept, and in particular upward mobility, I thought, well, it's like downward mobility, it's a phenomenon you may be talking about. But no, it turned out that it's something that happens in America because of its democratic structure, upward mobility. So that if you talk about another country having upward mobility, you are implying that it's a good country, it has a good government of a democratic type. Which is absurd, because in the Soviet Union, in the period I was looking at, this is one of massive industrialization. That means massive expansion of middle and upper ranks of society. Of course, there is going to be mass upward mobility. There were affirmative action programs as well, but it's going to happen anyway. And it's not going to happen because it's a good democratic government. It's going to happen because it's rapidly modernizing. Anyway, I will now skip forward into the 1980s when I'm in Texas, licking my wounds from the period at Columbia, which is also the height of the argument about revisionism, which, as you notice, I'm not talking about, but I will talk about if I have to. Anyway, so licking my wounds, I was quite. I had wounds to lick, basically. And I want to mention two books that I didn't write. In other words, that I did all the research for, and that I was sort of basically too scared, I think, to write up. One of them is a good book, well thought out. It was on the politics of industrialization in the 1930s. You see, when I was working on education, I saw their side of the politics, in which the industrialists who want a more narrowly technical education were their opponents. But I thought, industry is a big lobby, the Hasiashniki. So I'll have a look and see how that works. And it was really fascinating. And I had all the archival work done and the thing planned, and I just didn't write it. Now, I had another book called Social Mobility Under Stalin. And I had really good material for that, but I hadn't really thought it through. I had half the book written in this case when I left Columbia, and then I just that was the end of it. But what I hadn't thought, I had basically all my upward mobility stuff, and I had added the downward mobility, but I hadn't conceptually worked it through at all. So I don't consider that, even though I have the 3 chapters, I don't consider that a huge loss to science. So I started getting on my feet again and working again, writing again at the end of the 80s. Nobody noticed that I'd stopped writing. It was an interesting, there's a message there somewhere. Because I continued to be fairly controversial, so I think the assumption was I was continuing to do this stuff, but actually for 10 years I didn't do anything much. But then I started, the next interesting thing I did, I think, was an article called A Scribe in Class. It was published in JMH, I think, in the late 80s, and it's in Tear Off the Masks. Now, that was answering unlike Ron, I was not a Marxist, and I didn't regard the class framework as a particularly productive one for analyzing Soviet society. On the other hand, I could never get away from it. And so I was puzzled about this. Why is it? I don't think class is the real relevant variable, and yet I stumble on it all the time. And of course, that is partly because my sources keep using the class framework. But it wasn't only that. I suddenly realized, okay, class becomes much less relevant than you might expect after the revolution because of the disintegration of existing classes and their slowness to reform and the degree of state control over the reformation. But what is terribly important is class labeling. In other words, what class you are thought to be because your life chances depend on it. If you are thought to be a kulak, your life chances are very bad. In other words, you can't, jobs, education, and so on. If you can pass yourself off as a poor peasant or as proletarian, doors open before you. So I was very happy to have just found out that class may not matter, but class labeling really does matter. So that was an important milestone. Then we have the 90s. Then I'm in Chicago. Chicago is actually a wonderful period, as Ron was saying, the 1990s and 2000s. This is when all kinds of research possibilities were open in the Soviet Union. There were lots of PhD students at Chicago. They all went off to different places. Everybody could do a pioneering work on something. Nobody had to sort of go into ground that had already been worked over. It was a wonderful time. Now, what I was doing then was writing up the work that I had done in the 80s that I hadn't been able to write. And that's Stalin's Peasants on collectivization. It's accusatory practices, that's on denunciation as a practice, Tbilisi. And then everyday Stalinism, also Cultural Front is in that period. So a lot of stuff at that time. Although I have to say that for me, probably the most exciting thing was not so much writing those books, because I'd been living with that material already for 15 years or so. It was the stuff that the students were coming back with, the PhD people. I mean, there were really, really interesting and strange stuff that people were finding out, and that I was, of course, also processing as they come back and they reported to the workshop. The range of our knowledge about the Soviet Union expanded enormously at that point, and I think the level of the scholarship. I'm talking history here. I'm usually always talking about history, not more broadly. Then I did after I went back to Australia. In the period when the classified archives opened up after Perestroika and after, I of course went and worked on von Stalin because it wasn't my topic or anything, but who could resist going and reading what is in Stalin's personal archive? So I worked on that, and I also had, from my early contacts from when I was there, I had some first-hand account of people who'd been on the fringes of high politics. Anyway, I had a sense of how the high politics worked, of how it worked, and I had not done anything political before, unless you count the cultural policy. I'd been a social historian. But it struck me as very interesting to use the kind of approach that I'd used in analyzing the everyday strategies of survival and so on, to apply that to the Politburo under Stalin. And that's what I did on Stalin's Team, which is a book I'm actually quite fond of. I didn't stay with the politics, but it actually reminded me that I forgot to say about my father that he was a sort of freelance human rights person, which meant in his case that he loved politics as a game. You know, the process of finding out how to either influence policy or annoy the people who influence policy and so on. So that is a part of me that's sort of usually dormant, but I have some feeling for that kind of political process. So then I went, I go back to Australia, but I didn't go to I didn't go back to where I came from. I went to Sydney. And that, of course, made me interested in migration and the reinvention of self when you move. Now, if you know my book, Tear Off the Masks, that is about invention of self under various kinds of circumstances of upheaval. Well, migration is not one of the, I had never been the kind of upheaval I'd looked at. First of all, I'd looked at revolution, and then I'd looked at collapse of the Soviet Union. But migration, of course, presents the same challenges. In the new context, you've got to be a slightly different person. And you tell a different backstory often. In any case, so plus I thought, I'm going to Australia. Nobody in Australia cares about Russia. I better have something I do that I can talk to someone about. And they do migration in Australia. So then I did a bunch of books. The first book I did was about Soviet displaced persons, specifically who went to Australia after the Second World War. Normally, they were not admitting to being Soviet. And the Australian government didn't realize they were Soviet. They didn't even fully realize they were Russian, because all DPs lie about who they are. And so, they have them down as Poles, Ukrainians, Yugoslavs, or whatever. But anyway, so that was a group that kind of appealed to me. And the other thing that appealed to me is this very anti-communist group comes into Australia in the Cold War, plugs into the Cold War politics, because the role that you could take as an anti-communist recent migrant, it was an eyewitness. I have seen communism, and I can tell you what it's like at first hand. So that was White Russians and then Lost Souls, the same body of archival work. That is the UNRWA in New York, IRO in Paris archives, and this wonderful collection of re-entry interviews with the Soviet Repatriation Commission, which I could talk about at greater length if anybody's interested. So I think I've probably run out of time. I would just say that what I'm doing at the moment, though, quite briefly, is that I'm doing another. I write these memoirs, but the one thing I never write memoirs is about the American years, which were quite a few years. Anyway, but I thought maybe publishers would like me to write the American one. So I thought maybe I'll do 1989, and that is both a personal story for me, what happens in 1989, but of course also there was some stuff going on in the world, particularly for a Sovietologist. In other words, everything's up in the air at that point. And so I am both doing a book which is called Happy End. That's from my point of view, that's the personal story. But of course, as far as the Soviet Union is concerned, there might be or Russia, a question about how happy is the end. So there's a degree of irony in there. But that goes along with work on on a more scholarly project, which is basically what happened to Sovietology with the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the paradigm within which we had worked about knowing the enemy, the collapse of funding, the sudden loss of relevance of the field, how people cope with it. And I think there are very different disciplinary stories here, awful for political science, basically, because of the question of prediction. You didn't predict. If you didn't predict, what use to you? Okay for historians, although with a bit of iffiness in there. Lovely for anthropologists who suddenly can come in and make an impact and so on. Anyway, that's where I am at the moment. Thank you.
So, I wasn't sure what to talk about. But I think I'm going to do what I've done pretty much throughout my professional life, and that is follow Ron and Sheila. So again, I wasn't going to talk about my family, but might as well. I was born during the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, so I'm a child of the thaw. And I'm also a child of the revolution in that my parents would never have met if not for the Bolsheviks. So I'm very, very grateful to, I must confess to not having been grateful to them, sufficiently grateful to them, until I met these revisionists. But I should have, because as I think I mentioned in one of our previous discussions, my mother's parents were Jewish communists who went to the Soviet Union from Buenos Aires, Argentina, to build communism with a Jewish face. So they went straight to Azerbaijan, the Jewish Autonomous Republic, where they founded a settlement called Sotsgorodok, where they lost their first child. And before going to Moscow, where my grandfather, a textile worker and Yiddish writer, was promptly arrested. And I just told Nina a story that I guess I might as well tell you, how a year and a half after his arrest, my grandmother was sleeping in a tiny room, which I remember quite vividly, where they lived with her two daughters. My mother was 5 years old. There was a knock on the door. She opened the door, and there was her husband with a big beard. And they cried and they hugged, and then they realized that as far as my mother was concerned, he had been in the Far East for work, and she would expect some presents. And so if this were not a Jewish story, it would have been a Christmas one. They, in the middle of the night, in the middle of the winter, went around Moscow knocking on the doors of their friends, and virtually all of their friends were Jews from Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil, who'd come over on the same boat, looking for chocolates, candy, and so when my mother woke up, there it was. But then my grandfather was, then the war began, and he was killed in the war, allowing my grandmother, who'd never been to school, she'd been a textile worker in Argentina, to become the widow of a Soviet writer. and have all kinds of, anyway, and be in good order, so to speak. She was a night shift nanny and a seamstress in a kindergarten. And maybe just one more story, and she was a great storyteller, told a lot of stories, so that's, I guess, the story of my revolution. One of them was about her husband, my grandfather, soon after he returned from prison, telling her that if we survive this hell, if we ever get out of this horrible place, we'll go back to Buenos Aires, visit your mother's grave, kneel by your mother's grave, and ask her forgiveness for not listening to her when she told us, don't do it. She, my grandmother, considered her entire life to have been a horrible mistake. Had a very tragic view of life. And the only thing that kept her going, besides me and my cousin, her other grandchild, were letters she would receive from her relatives, the few surviving ones, scattered around the world. And she would translate them for me regularly. Now, my father's family came from one of those families that Dominic described in his presentation yesterday. So they were many generations of cavalry officers. And so my actual great-grandfather was a general who had an affair with a Polish ballerina, and I still have a lock of her hair in my Moscow apartment. So there was a big scandal. He was transferred to political police and ended his career as a general in the Жандармское управление. His father had been the military commander of the Odessa military district, and so that kind of family. There were never any letters from any relatives. My father took no interest in what happened to his cousins, to his brother, who all left with the whites. Most of them fought on the side of the whites in the revolution. And you should have seen my two grandmothers at some family events sitting next to each other. One educated at the School for Noble Maidens in Kiev, wearing a hat with a feather, little veil, and never bending her back. And my Jewish grandmother trying her damnedest with special perm and this pink blouse that she wore on those occasions, trying really hard to feel like she belonged there. Anyway, where was I? But I was brought up, I was just sort of standard issue anti-Soviet, Soviet intelligentsia type. But I was not going to be an academic. I left the Soviet Union in 1982, hoping to have adventures, to see the world and so on. I spent a year working in Mozambique, and then after a year in Lisbon, I decided to move somewhere else. And I had two options. One was to join some of my Portuguese friends and go work in Germany or in France. That was before Portugal joined the EU. Or I was told that the easiest way to get to the United States was to go to graduate school. So I figured, why not use this excuse? Took some persuading. You know, the US consul didn't quite believe that I, as a Portuguese graduate student, was going to come back to this, to Lisbon. But anyway, I did get my visa and went to graduate school. In Texas, yeah, and I went to Texas. Needless to say, I'd never heard of any Soviet historians. And went to Texas because a woman I had met in Moscow lived there. And I was told that I could teach Russian because I needed to keep my body and soul together somehow. And and I in Lisbon, speaking of teaching, my teaching career began at the traffic police in Lisbon when I pretended to be English, believe it or not. I say I was half English, half Russian, just in case. I still remember, teaching them how to say, "Where is your driving license? Where is the nearest petrol station?" Anyway, I did my best there, and that was the beginning of my career in pedagogy. So there I found myself in the Slavic department. So in order to be able to teach Russian, I had to be a graduate student in the Slavic department. But I had studied Russian literature and linguistics at Moscow University, and I really didn't want to be there and do it all over again in English now. So one of the professors in the Slavic department was also in the history department, Sidney Monas, and he said he could help me transfer to history, and I wanted to do African history because of my African experiences. But they told me I couldn't do African history because in order for me to continue teaching Russian, I had to do something connected to Russia, and that's how I met Sheila Fitzpatrick, a forbidding-looking person, aloof, unapproachable, and pro-Soviet. And I thought, damn, where am I? What am I doing here? And then I remember Sheila convened a conference in, I guess, 83 or 84 it was, for all the revisionists. I remember there was the revisionists. And there were, for those of you who know, it was Arch Getty there and Lynn Viola and
that's where we met.
Mark von Hagen, and those people I just mentioned, I mean, very nice people, as I found out later, and good historians, but not necessarily overflowing with charisma. And there was Ron, larger than life. And I remember, and that's actually true, that of all the books Sheila had me read on Soviet history, I liked Ron's book the best, on the Baku Commune, because it was very different from the kind of revolution I knew, I had been taught. But it took basically one seminar. And Sheila made it clear early on that she was not amused by Soviet emigres who thought they knew something about Soviet history by virtue of having lived in the Soviet Union. And it took one seminar for Sheila to disabuse me of most of my misconceptions about Soviet history and to begin to teach me things about history and about the Soviet Union. And I don't remember whether we actually talked about my dissertation topic or whether anyway, the reason, just I will quickly talk about my work, all of which had to do with my personal experiences. So I really wanted to do African history. And so what can a person interested in African history can do in Soviet history? Also, living in Texas, I did a lot of driving around, visiting, among other things, several Indian reservations in New Mexico, Arizona. Just the Southwest, we traveled a lot. And then I realized there are native people living in the Soviet Union. There are hunter-gatherer populations living in Siberia and in the northern part of Russia. And why do I not know anything about them? Why does America have a west, but Russia has no east? Why there is westward expansion and the conquest of one continent, and there is no eastward expansion and the conquest of another continent, at least as far as my Soviet education was concerned. I later found out that there were plans in the Soviet Union to create reservations for some of those reindeer breeders and walrus hunters and others, and taiga trappers. So anyway, so I ended up writing my dissertation on the history of the so-called small peoples of the North. People seen by the Soviet state as by far the most backward citizens of the USSR. And so I wrote the history of Russian and Soviet perceptions, representations of those people, Cossacks, missionaries, state officials, intellectuals, legislators, later Soviet activists, and so on. What kind of sense they made of those people and their place in the empire. I had actually two supervisors, one of whom was Sidney Monas, the professor who helped me move to the history department, and who I remember corrected the spelling of the word vicissitude in my dissertation. And Sheila, who I repeat, taught me everything I knew about Soviet history. But she didn't know really anything about the small peoples of the North, so I contributed to her knowledge of Russian and Soviet history the best I could. We co-edited a book, was originally, of course, Sheila's idea, a book on women and the Russian Revolution. Women's autobiographical statements of various kinds, or ego texts, as some people call them, memoirs, letters, diaries, interviews, and so on. And so my contribution was to smuggle in some anti-Bolshevik women into that collection, because Sheila's original idea was actually to focus on those who benefited from the revolution. But of course, I realized working with Sheila that I had grown up, without realizing it, surrounded by various beneficiaries of upward mobility. Except it was a different contingent of beneficiaries from Soviet upward mobility. I, growing up, was surrounded by Soviet Jews. And the upward mobility in their families was remarkable, extraordinary. So they were all basically at the top of the Soviet, of Soviet intellectual elite. They were self-conscious about being at the top. And they were very anti-Soviet. And virtually everyone I knew had a Bolshevik grandparent. So I got a little curious about that, about how you get from those grandparents to those grandchildren. But in the meantime, thinking about my impressed and influenced by Sheila, social history, and then part of it became history of everyday life, I decided to write a history of my paternal grandmother's communal apartment, or in a communal apartment like that, an apartment where several families live, sharing the kitchen and the bathroom, and do a history of one of those. And I looked at a variety of apartments, but I realized that I probably wouldn't be able to find one with enough archives, letters, diaries, whatever, because people, would leave, and so I wouldn't be able to reproduce a life. And so I kept looking at different places and ended up with the largest building in Europe. And so would eventually write a book on the history of this so-called House of Government, otherwise known as the House on the Embankment, where most members, those who didn't fit into the Kremlin, those members of Soviet elite didn't fit into the Kremlin, lived there, most of them, I would say, at the top level. And one of the things I noticed about the residents of that house was not only that there were so many Jews among the Bolsheviks. That didn't come as a surprise, because by then I had read or rather at some point back in the Soviet Union, I had read Solzhenitsyn, where everyone I knew was really struck by the fact that pretty much everyone in charge of the Gulag was, at the top, was Jewish. But here, not only do I see that there's so many of them, but I noticed that they're really different from all the other residents. And I mentioned that in one of my presentations, that you could be a communist and a Pole at the same time, you could be a communist and a Latvian at the same time, but you couldn't be a communist and a Jew at the same time. And I was struck by how much effort those people put into no longer being Jewish. I was also struck by the fact that they were all immigrants. I'd heard about Jewish emigration to America, including South America, and that's my grandparents' route, before they moved in the opposite direction. And of course, Jewish emigration to the United States and to Palestine. A tiny trickle compared to the massive migration to America. But I'd never thought of all those people I'd grown up with, who would all talk about, basically, they had a strong sense of superiority, shall I say, over the natives, forgetting about my poor father's presence at the table. And so I got really interested in trying to connect those original Bolsheviks and the people I grew up with. And so I forgot to mention that they were all immigrants, except that they moved from the same area. Rather than moving to America or to Palestine, they moved to Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev, and Kharkiv. And so I ended up writing a book called The Jewish Century, which I dedicated to my Jewish grandmother, who considered her whole life to have been a mistake. And then I returned to the book on the House of Government, which had grown out of the communal apartment where my other grandmother lived. And maybe just to leave more time for the Q&A, I'll just say that the book I'm writing right now, I'm not going to talk about my career, the least interesting part of my life, particularly the especially uneventful years I spent at Berkeley, about 3 decades. The book I'm writing right now is the result of my, I think I mentioned this to you at some point, of the discovery I made when I arrived in Portugal as an émigré. And that is that they had their own Pushkin, so to speak. And then looking around and realizing that pretty much every European nation had its own Pushkin. And so I decided to write a comparative history of those cults, a book that has now become a history of canons, and then their demise in the world in which we live. So maybe if I'm to address you, I can say that I think the key to an interesting life in academia, I think, is to work on something that you find personally interesting and meaningful. So thank you very much.